Everybody has a story, and every story needs to be heard. On this podcast, we are talking with each member of the General Conference Leadership Council. I'm your host, Alyssa Truman, and this is ANN Profiles. Today, I am here with Lisa Beardsley-Hardy. She serves as the Director of Education for the General Conference. Hello, Lisa.
Hi, Alyssa.
How are you?
Very good, thank you.
It is delightful to have you here with me. So we are in the same Sabbath school class. We go to the same church, same Sabbath school class. But you know what? I do not know much about you. I know that you're the education director. I know that you have Finnish and Japanese roots.
That's right.
I know that you have an amazing husband.
Yep.
And I know that you have an education background. So we're going to fill in all those blanks of things that I don't know about Lisa. So let's start at the very beginning. Where were you born?
I was born in England, and it's thanks to the Sabbath that I was born there. My mother is Finnish, as you alluded to. Half of it is Finnish. And she wanted to study nursing, but in Finland at that time, they required Sabbath classes. So she and some other young ladies went to England to study. And meanwhile, from the other side of the world, my father was raised Buddhist. He's Japanese, raised in Hawaii. And he had never really heard of Christ before until after the war. After the war, that is the Second World War, well, towards the end, he was in the army. He was part of the military intelligence as a Japanese translator, trained as a translator in the Philippine Islands, persuading Japanese troops that the war had ended. And they captured quite a few of those troops, and I grew up with some of the things that he had. He got some flags and samurai swords from those captures. After the war, he came back to Hawaii, and he started to take some night classes at it was just a program near his house. And one of those classes was called Life and Teachings of Christ. He said he'd, of course, heard of Jesus before, but he had no idea whether Jesus had 2 disciples or 20 disciples. And after taking that class, he was really intrigued, and he decided to go to the main campus. And the main campus was in California. It was a college called Pacific Union College. And from there, he went on to Atlantic Union College and was quite taken with what he was learning and became a theology major. He then, over time, went into ministry. He was the intern for the Japanese church in L.A. and hit a real crisis of faith and didn't know what to do. He went back into the military, where he had been before, but this time in a medic capacity, and was stationed in England. He still believed in the Seventh-day Sabbath. He still believed in what Seventh-day Adventists taught. He just was still recovering from the crisis of faith that he had at the Japanese church in L.A. And it was at a Seventh-day Adventist meeting that he met my mother. So thanks to Seventh-day Adventism and different routes on both sides, my father's and my mother, I was born in England, as well as my brother who came along later.
So were they at Newbold?
No, my father was stationed at the American base in Newbury in England, where the Royal Air Force is, the British Royal Air Force, but there was a U.S. base there at the time. And my mother was studying nursing in Newbury, but there were a lot of Finns who went to Newbold at that time, and so they would get together. And they were actually married in London.
Okay, so it wasn't even... So with your mom, it wasn't even like she'd gone to an Adventist school or something. She just was trying to find a place where there were no classes on
Correct.
Sabbath. Ended up meeting in Newbury.
Right.
And wow, that is an impressive story of God's providence in bringing people together.
And faithfulness because of the Sabbath. One time I was thinking what's happening right now with the war in Ukraine. And that was the same situation with my mother's family. They are from eastern Finland. Now it's Russia because of the war between Russia and Finland. And so they were evacuees into Finland proper. And I thought if it weren't for the war, if it weren't for my mother going to nursing school, I would probably be a farmer's wife somewhere in eastern Finland with 9 or 12 children, like my mother. She grew up with 9 children. But then I started thinking about it, and I realized I wouldn't be at all.
It's true, because you wouldn't have met your dad.
That's right. He wouldn't have met them, and there would have been no way. And so even the crisis of war and being refugees, not once, but twice, not refugees because they were evacuees, properly speaking, because they stayed within their country and were evacuated from that part of Finland, Karjala, into the interior part of Finland. And when the soldiers retreated, they retreated. Their house and farm was burnt to the ground. They rebuilt everything. And then the war came back and they had to be evacuated a second time. So God has even redeemed that terrible experience of war on my mother's side and on my father's side. My father he was born in a place called Aiea. Aiea is just above Pearl Harbor, and he was there when it was bombed.
Oh, wow. So they've both gone through some pretty traumatic experiences with war before they even came together.
Yes, and it was on his part, even the crisis of faith. The Lord didn't let go of his hand. He's the only Christian on that side of the family. They're all Buddhist. He's the only one that became a Seventh-day Adventist and the only one who became a Christian.
Wow. So that's even hard, because it's like you're leaving behind everything you know and all that crisis. So he meets your mother. They
Yes, and
fall in love.
Yes, but my mother was not technically Seventh-day Adventist then, because, and that's the previous war, my mother was something that today is called Reformed Adventist. And that is those Adventists who felt that you should not fight, even to defend yourself, to defend your property. And I just mentioned the war, and that was something that my grandfather, who was a farmer and a blacksmith, felt very deeply about, that you keep the Sabbath command no matter what, and you don't kill no matter what, too. So when this came to a head in Europe, starting in Germany, and then filtering up to Finland, who also was affected by the war, he felt no matter what, we will not fight, and instead chose to retreat. So she was raised in this Reformed tradition. There still are some Reformed Adventists, not so many, but...
So she was Reformed Adventist. He had a background in Seventh-day Adventism and all this. So they get together. They get married. How shortly after were you a part of their life?
I counted it once, and it was 8.5 months. So I asked my mother about this.
She didn't mean to unwind that one.
And she said I was early. She said I've always been early and everything. That is one of my pet peeves. I hate being late.
Even to your own birth. You were like, I will not even be late to my birth. Not even on time.
Yes.
That's actually one of my pet peeves too, Lisa. I really, I've always told people that it's like, you always should be early. Like, I'm never going to have someone wait on me that's like my worst fear is people having to wait for me. It's like, which is, nobody in my family quite gets it to the same level I have it, but that's okay. You might get it.
Yes,
but
I do.
My family
absolutely, absolutely. I really do not like being late.
So were you raised in England then?
No. After my brother was born, also in England, my father was dishonorably discharged, and he was accepted into a doctoral program at the University of Maryland. So we moved to College Park, Maryland. And we lived in a place, and we just were there last night, my husband and I, IKEA.
Oh, okay.
IKEA at that time was a big trailer park, and that's where my earliest childhood memories are of that. That when we drove into IKEA, I just said to Frank, wow, this just brings back flashbacks of childhood. I remember living here. And then we moved to Adelphi Road, which is not far from here as well, when my father was just finishing. And I can remember going to the University of Maryland with him. And he took me to the college bookstore, and he bought me my very first book. I was thrilled about it.
Do you know what the book
was? Oh,
was?
Yes, Webster's Dictionary.
The Webster's Dictionary is your first
my
book?
first book.
It's a good thing you go into education, Lisa. It all makes sense right now. So what's your favorite word in the dictionary?
Oh, in English? Or in what word?
Sure, let's go with English.
Probably redemption. Yeah, that Christ truly does redeem things. Like I just mentioned, war. He redeemed it for us as a family. There was a lot of nostalgia. I wonder what the farm was like. And my mother lived her whole life thinking maybe someday she would go back to the farm again. And she told me about that even when she was dying. I told her about the stream because she used to tell me there's a stream there and there's blue clay. And they would take the clay and they would make little birds and dry them on the side of the stream. And there are flowers that grow there like a ranunculus kind of globe flower, it's called in Finnish. And she would tell me about these. So I was telling her that as in her last days, and she said, "How did you know that?" And I just could assure her that heaven will be that much more beautiful than her memories of that part of Karjala was. So Christ will redeem that too. So redemption, that's my favorite
Do you have a
word.
favorite Finnish word?
It depends on what we're talking about, but probably
It can be
redemption.
whatever you want. If you want
Yes.
to pick a special.
I would have to think about that because there are times when the Finnish word is just the only right way to say something. And even with Frank, I'll tell him it's this and this is what it means, but it doesn't quite exactly mean that. Each language has something that is very precise for whatever that is. And pelastus, which is what redemption is or salvation, it doesn't have the same feel. The English is really better in this
Okay,
case.
interesting. All right, so you're here in Maryland and you're being raised. Are your parents actively attending a church? Is their faith strong at this point?
Yes. Oh, there. I have a kind of funny picture of me sitting on the lawn chair with my father, and he's got his nose in reading some of Ellen White's writings. He still remained very, very deeply interested in spiritual matters. He did a PhD in clinical psychology, but he never lost that love of the spiritual depths. I have another picture where I'm modeling my new Sabbath purse and my new Sabbath hat, and a third picture from those days where I'm sitting on the ground with my, by then, a younger sister was born, and I'm explaining something to her in the book. I think it was a picture album. I'm explaining something, and I just like kids can sit on the ground with their feet straight in front of them, their knees just flat against the ground. So I've got my feet up like as an
can't do
adult,
that
I
now.
can't do that. But I'm sitting there like that, and she's looking at it, and I'm explaining something in there. But my slippers are on the wrong feet, so they're like one going this way and one going that way. So I still haven't gotten it right. But that's probably where the education started
You're
with my
already starting
siblings.
to educate
And
people.
then another sister came
Okay,
after
so there's
that.
4 of
They're
you?
all 4, yeah.
Okay.
And when we go to National Airport, we drive right by the hospital where my sisters were born. I remember that too. I tell Frank, at that time there used to be a phone box at the bottom of the hill, and my father took us. They wouldn't let us into the hospital after my youngest sister was born. My father took us, and I remember him lifting me up because the cord of the phone was kind of short in the telephone box. And so he's lifting me up, and I'm talking to her, and I could hear her. And I just was very concerned. And I said, "Mommy, did it hurt?" I was really concerned about. And she said, "No, Lisa, it didn't hurt." So I think of that when we drive by there. We lived here until I was 7, and I did go to the orientation for school at what today is Tacoma Academy. And again, I have fleeting memories of that. But my father got called to Loma Linda University to be on the faculty there. So we moved to Loma Linda, and we were there for a while, right near where today it's the Fitness and Wellness Center off of Cole Road, not Cole Road. It's going to come to me in a moment.
It's
But-
okay. We can wait for it to come in a moment.
Yes.
So you can keep going.
Yes, Cole Street.
Okay, Cole Street.
It was, yeah, not a road. And so that was my earliest schooling, was at Loma Linda Elementary School. And partway through that, he then went over to the psychiatric hospital across the way in Highland, and we moved. So I did go to Fairland Adventist School.
What's some of
first
your
grade.
favorite childhood memories from school years?
Well,
since
from
education
that
is your
time-
thing, I want to know about your education.
Education, I remember second grade, I now went to a public school. And I remember walking home, and I guess at school they must have given us this little Gideon Bibles, just the small little hand-sized one, and I was so happy about that. Walking home with a Bible, holding it in my hand, and just sensing God's presence. As a little girl, it was like holding the hand of God, walking back home. And that same, we had to walk by an irrigation ditch there in Highland. And I can remember with my brother and I, when they would let the water out of the irrigation ditches, at that time there were orange groves everywhere. Today, there are hardly any orange trees. They're just apartment blocks. But
It's true.
but we would get at the top of the irrigation ditch and let the water push us down. And we learned something because it's made out of cement and rock. And if you do that long enough, it'll wear the pants right off of you. All that abrasion and
Oops. It sounds like a fun memory, though.
Yes. My brother and I are a year apart, and then the middle sister, that was a year and a half later, and then the youngest is a year and 1 month later. So we were just four munchkins. We had very happy childhood growing up. My father loved to fish, which meant we had to find water somewhere, beaches. And while he would fish, we would swim and body surf and look for shells. And after that, after California, Loma Linda, and then the psychiatric hospital, that was a psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane. It's still there for those who had committed crimes and would not be kept in prison for reason of mental illness. The stories he told us were not like the normal stories you hear as a child. He would tell us about his most colorful patients, and I won't relate them
That's
here
okay.
because they're criminals. They're pretty gruesome. But these are the kinds of stories that I grew up
It wasn't
hearing.
Uncle
Right.
Arthur bedtime story version.
Well, speaking of Uncle Arthur's bedtime story, when we lived on Adelphi Road, and I was 5 or 6 years old, on Christmas, we got a gift that was all wrapped up in a box, and it was wrapped, each one was wrapped in brown paper, and when we tore that back, it was Uncle Arthur's bedtime stories in this orange cover, and I remember us screaming and jumping up and down. We were so happy. We loved those books. They were wonderful books. So yes, we did grow up with Uncle Arthur's bedtime
as well as
stories.
your father's bedtime stories.
No, they weren't bedtime stories. They were just, he would just tell us what he did at work that day. And when he was working at the psychiatric hospital, I remember one day I asked my mother, Mommy, how long does it take to get a PhD? And she said, well, you're going to have to wait till your father gets home, and he can explain that to you. So I sat out on the driveway, again, like kids do, sitting on there with their legs straight out in front of them. I don't know why kids sit that way, but I was patiently waiting for him to come home. And when he came, I asked him, Daddy, how long will it take me to get a PhD? Because I remembered him getting it. And he said, well, Lisa, first of all, you have to go to college, okay? And then you get a bachelor's degree, okay? Then you have to get a master's degree. And he actually had 2 master's degrees because he'd done Bachelor of Theology and then a master's in theology. And then after that, crisis of faith, and he went on to that, back to the military. And then he came back and shifted to clinical psych, and he had to do another master's degree from the University of Maryland in order to get into the doctoral, or to progress to the doctoral program. So he said, okay, you'll have to do a master's degree. And I'm counting as he's telling me, okay, how many years? Okay, 4 years. Okay, 2 years. Okay. And then you can do the PhD. So I was counting. I said, oh, I'm going to be 30. And I was 31. So it was about
Which 30
right.
when you're young seems really old. 30 to us now is not old at all.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I was so young.
Well, that was something from the age of 8 that I
So you knew
had.
you wanted a doctorate. Did you
Yes.
know in what?
I didn't. There were 2 things that really attracted me, and I didn't understand all of the ins and outs of it. One thing was I thought, wouldn't it be neat to be a flight attendant? That's not the doctorate part, but you could go down and you could give people blankets and you could give them water and see if they're comfortable and how things are going and chat with them. And then the second part was parapsychology. That interested me.
That's so different.
Well,
So
it was,
parapsychology.
yes, I was pretty sure I didn't want clinical psychology and psychiatric illnesses because I had grown up with that and seen that, and even to the extent of individuals committing serious crimes along with their mental illness. So I was not drawn to that, but I still was interested in spiritual parts. So parapsychology was that. And later, and that's the redemption part, later on becoming a born again Christian, that clarified itself to being spiritual health. And I went on to study theology. That's a redeemed parapsychology, spiritual life, spiritual well-being.
So
And I went to Newbold College.
you're like, I went to Newbold. So let's talk a little bit about this. So we've kind of bypassed elementary a little bit. Your high school years. Let's just kind of talk about those years. So these teen years, they can be hard years.
Yes.
Did you ever struggle with your faith? Were you
Wasn't,
always just very like, yep, this is what I am?
Yeah, it was part of faith. My father was in and out of the church. And so I look back on my diaries, and it would be, Daddy went to church today. Daddy didn't go to church today. We went to church with my mother. Whether Daddy went or not, we would go. And so that was part of it, particularly after we left California. We moved to Alabama. Now we're in the mid-60s. And this was a really difficult time in the South, Alabama. And I am half Japanese. So racism wasn't restricted to only blacks. It was also directed at Asians. And I don't look as Asian, but my brother looks very Japanese. And I can remember in third grade now in Alabama walking to school. We'd walk quite a way through the woods. And then at school, some of the boys picking on, pull their eyes and call him chink and things like this. And I'm the older sister, and I can remember just fuming, angry, and wanting to bloody somebody's nose. I didn't know who it was, and walking home with my brother and him just, that type of sobbing, crying, and me being so upset because my brother had been picked on. We then moved to Florida. Florida was better, but there was still a period of turbulence, of rioting, and we had to drive by the black school, and bricks being thrown and fires, and it was a very turbulent time. So by the time I was in fifth grade, where I lived, rather than having black schools and white schools and trying to force integration, new schools were built that were desegregated from the beginning. So I went to a desegregated school for grade 5, and that was a new experience to have blacks in with the whites. But that was all we knew. We knew that it was special, but there were still black schools and there were still white schools, but these desegregated schools. In grade 5, at the end of grade 5, with the consultation with the teachers, I skipped grade 6 and I went right on into grade 7. And that also was a new school. It was built as a desegregated school, and we were all bused from different places. The black kids from the black part of town, and the white kids where I lived, they were all whites. And we were bused to this new place, this new junior high school. So that's why I went for grade 7. Grade 8, now we moved again to New York, upstate New York, where my dad was the chief psychologist
What
for
part?
Newark.
Okay.
Newark is along the Erie Canal. It's between Rochester and Syracuse, south of Lake Ontario. So that school was, again, a public school, grade 8, and we lived for a period of time on the state hospital grounds. We lived in the nurses' quarters while our house was being built out in the countryside. And that was, again, I remember one day we had to cook downstairs, and I was down there cooking for the family, and there were just nurses who lived in there, but there are few others. We all had our own rooms as if we were one of the nurses in there. And I was down there cooking, and I heard a sound in the far end of the hall where they stored all of the lawn furniture and the umbrellas and the croquet things and all the things for summer. This was during the winter. So I went there and I turned on the light, and I could again hear like something. And I don't know why I did this. I'm like 14 by now. I don't know why I went to see what it was, but I did. And all of a sudden, this guy pops out from there, and he's wearing a white T-shirt and some white kind of long johns, but they're halfway off of him, and they're all wet at the bottom. And he starts running towards me, and I start running. He's bigger than me. And halfway up the hall, he grabs me, and I'm just like, I am a goner. It was one of the psychiatric patients, but he wasn't. I frightened him more than he frightened me. He was trying to just follow me and to get out of the building, and he understood now there's a doorway. We were up the stairwell. It was halfway where he caught me, and then he just kept on running. That poor patient had been wandering around between the buildings. There are tunnels between all the buildings, steam tunnels and utility tunnels, and they're locked. They're supposed to be locked, but somehow he either squeezed in there or whatever, he got in there, and who knows how many days he had been wandering around in these steam tunnels, and then somehow had squeezed out, or maybe somebody had left it locked. I didn't go check down there.
You're like, I'm not
again.
checking.
Well, I went and told my parents, and they called the security, and they eventually got the young man and got him back to wherever he needed to be. I had been there before just visiting the patients, and one of the patients, they're so happy to see people. This one lady just came and she squeezed me so hard, hugging me, she almost squeezed the breath out of me. She wouldn't stop squeezing me. She wasn't trying to strangle me. She just was this unrestrained strength that when you're in your right mind, you feel inhibitions that keep you from doing crazy things, but when you really are mentally ill, those inhibitions aren't there, and it's just all out. So that was my grade 8 year living in the nurses' quarters until the house was built, and then we moved out. There was on the bus, again, where this is not desegregated, this was not the South. So on the bus one day, some of the kids were talking about a man who lived in a cabin on the other side of the road. Hydesville is that community. And they said that he'll let you come in and see if you want, where there's some spirits. There was some sisters that lived there called the Fox Sisters. That had been their home, and they had been having seances with spirits. So my brother and I think it was my middle sister, we rode our bikes down there and knocked on the door. And some scruffy guy, old guy, he opens the door and he's glad to see some kids. He lived by himself. And we said, can we see the place where the spirits are? And he let us in. It was an old cabin, and he had to enter in through the front door, and he had his living room there, a little couch. And then towards the back, he had a kitchen, sink, and it was messy. But halfway there, he had a stair going down and to the cellar. So we went down to the cellar. He had the lights on so we could get down there. And when we got down there, he turned the lights off. And then he turned on some Christmas lights, the big bulb, not the little fairy lights that we have nowadays. They were bigger ones. And he had put them around something that he had dug out in the cellar. It was about the size of a coffin, but he was dug into the earth. And it was a ground earth cellar. It was not a paved cellar. And it just smelled dank. And so we're all sitting there in the dark, and we're looking at the Christmas lights. And he said, if you look right there in the middle, sometimes you'll see the spirits appearing. So we're looking there, and we're starting to get pretty creeped out by this point. I didn't see any spirits, but we felt like we'd had enough, so we just scrambled up the stairs, and we went and took our bikes and went home. That was the home of the Fox Sisters, and it has burnt down now, but it is a shrine that is run by the American, I think, Spiritist Association, and they do have a plaque there for the Fox Sisters commemorating them and the modern birth of spiritualism. We went to the East Palmyra Seventh-day Adventist Church at that time. And East Palmyra is just a few miles.
From where Mormonism
Yes,
starts.
Palmyra.
Because you're right.
That's
So I
right.
grew up in the same area.
Okay.
So you're like right in the center of where many faiths started.
Exactly. Yes. Joseph Smith supposedly had a vision with the angel Moroni that came down on what they call Mount Cumorah. It's a hill. Really.
It's very much a hill.
Yeah, it's not a mount. Yeah, those are called drumlands, and that part of New York
yeah.
has drumlands, which are glacial formations. So suppose he found them, they transcribed them, and then that's the Book of Mormon. They used to have a pageant every year.
Yes.
There, this
On
huge,
Yes.
on Mount Cumorah, which is quite a pageant.
So,
Well, there's one more thing
okay,
there.
go ahead.
Right near there, between the two, East Palmyra, and if you go on, I think that's 31. I think that's the main road.
I think
okay,
that's 31.
There is another little community, and that's called Port Gibson, which used to be a port on the Erie Canal that runs through Newark and all the way up to Rochester. And that's where the vision of the sanctuary was given. And that's now one of the properties of the Adventist Historic Society.
So Hiram Edson's
barn and farm.
Yes, I sang there on the 150th anniversary. I was in high school.
Wow.
So
where did you grow up?
I grew up in Fulton. So it's just north of Syracuse, right on Lake Ontario, between Oswego and Syracuse.
I know Oswego. Okay.
And I went to school in Union Springs
for
a year. So I'm very familiar with this whole...
Well, they used to have camp meeting at Union Springs.
Yes, they still do. Okay. 10 days. The whole 10-day
that was with tents. When I was there, it was real tents, too. They still have tents?
I'm trying to think. I think some people camp, but they have cabins now that they build on property and stuff like that. But yes, my whole family, that's where all my relatives, that my mom's side, my dad's side, all of us, that is our area.
All right.
So so you're here in all of this area. And I know that you're going to end up, how do you end up in Newbold?
Well, from Newark, my father was transferred, or not transferred, he applied to Bath, New York, the VA hospital. He was military, as I told you before. So he was also in and out with appointments. Either he was teaching part-time, University of Florida, University of Alabama, Alfred in New York. Mm-hmm. He did some lecturing there at SUNY, Alfred, in addition to his clinical work. And now he went to Bath, New York, which there's a big VA who's the chief psychologist there. So we moved there. And for a very short stint, I went to Kingsway College. Okay. Very, very short stint. And then came back and graduated. Well, I didn't graduate. It was grade 11 from Newark, not Newark, Bath Haverling High School, which is in Bath. My sisters went to Hammondsport, which is where we lived on the Finger Lakes. But my brother and I, because he was a tennis player, very good tennis player, and then I was in music, so we went to Bath. Every morning we drove with my dad to Bath. And in grade 11, at the end of grade 11, it was partly in the argument with my father and partly my aunt who came and my grandmother who came visiting from Finland. We'd have grandmother visits. The Buddhist grandma from Hawaii would come and visit. And then my Finnish grandma, who was still, to the time she died, she was a Reformed Adventist, she would come and visit. So my grandmother and my aunt from Finland were visiting. And my aunt said, why doesn't Lisa come to Finland and study there? And so that was just a rough time with my father. So when my father was on one of his meetings, professional meeting, probably APA, American Psychological Association, my mother helped me pack up and I went to Finland.
Oh, wow.
And I went to study at our Adventist Junior College. So that was my junior year in grade 11. And I just never went home. From there, then I went to Newbold because everybody in Finland who was going to study theology went to Newbold. Right.
What made you decide to study theology, Lisa?
Well, when I left, my mother put 2 books in my suitcase and a Bible. And so I happened to notice the Bible. I took that out and left it, but I didn't notice the 2 books. The books were Great Controversy and Steps to Christ. I didn't speak Finnish. It was familiar because I'd heard it my whole life, but since we left England, we were not around that many Finns. Yes, my relatives and
But it's
aunts.
not
And,
common.
right, exactly. So it was a long, cold winter. I lived with my cousin in the dormitory, and so I started reading the books. And I read Steps to Christ first, and that deeply touched me. And then Great Controversy, and that was absolutely riveting. By the time I finished that book, I was converted. And when summer came, I asked to be baptized. So just before I turned 18, I was baptized at the summer camp, the Adventist summer camp, in really frigid water. They heat up the sauna before someone gets baptized.
So you can go and get warmed
yes,
up.
and they have a blanket ready for you, and so you're like ice dipping. The ice had melted, but it's seriously cold. And then you go in, not to take a sauna, but just to
I know,
warm,
to warm up. That's
right,
it.
just warm up enough that you can get back in your clothes. So after that, it was clear to me I have to study psychology. And I started first year there, second year there, and somebody was coming through, and I don't remember who it was. Well, it first started that Barney Allen Mersch, who had his own little travel company there, and his parents had been missionaries in India, maybe India at least. He said, let's all go to Spicer. It's going to be cheap. We'll get a great experience. And so he went ahead of time. And about 2 months later, this is, again, the days of phone booths where you put in 5p and 10p, the big coins. So he calls back and he says, it's terrible here.
Oh, no.
He said, the library does not have very many books in theology. The hostels are overcrowded. It's very hot. So I had already thought that I would go to Spicer, but with that and he said, I'm coming back to England. And he did. But somebody was coming through and they said, there is a new seminary that's affiliated with Andrews. So everybody at Newbold goes on to Andrews to finish their degree. So everybody that I knew was going to go there, but this person said, whoever it was, this new seminary is affiliated with Andrews, and it's in the Philippines. And this was during martial law. Ferdinand Marcos was still president. But it sounded like an adventure, and I'm 20 years old, and what do I know about
Why not?
dictators? And right, exactly, and martial law. And so I and a few other Finns went as well. And I can remember landing, through Kuala Lumpur, that was still nice, but landing in Manila, and when they opened the door and you had to go down the ramp to the tarmac at that time, just coming to the door and like the heat and the humidity was so much about pushed me back into the plane. And thus it wasn't easy to go back and forth. So that's IS, Adventist International Institute of Advanced Studies. When I got there, the other Finns were doing graduate studies. I didn't know that it was only graduate. So they made an accommodation. They didn't send me back, and they let me take the rest of my BTH, Bachelor of Theology classes with the graduate students. And in the last year, the Greek teacher asked if I would be his grading assistant, his teaching assistant, to grade all the Greek papers, which was a great way to learn Greek. And it also, I earned a little bit of money by that.
What did you want to do with this degree?
I had no idea. And in my last year, I found out that the Seventh-day Adventist Church didn't ordain women or have women pastors, which was a huge shock because I just presumed that's what I would be doing. And by the time I graduated, I was the only woman. Now, it was an unusual situation because I was the only undergrad in that program. But I just assumed I would do that, and it was a shock, a terrible shock, because now what do I do with a BTH? And I had an experience then that was very painful. It was during the summer before I graduated. We had to do this Metro Manila Crusade, public evangelism. It was a required course. And an individual from the GC came to teach the course and to conduct the evangelism. So all of us seminary students, we were bused from Ceylon to Manila, and we had to stay on the, at that time, PUC, Philippine Union College campus in Baez. I was right down in Caloocan City. They've moved out now to Ceylon, but that time they were in the city. And all the guys stayed in the guys' dorm, and I was the only female, so I stayed in the female dorm, and they just put me in with a couple of Filipino ladies and a Thai student. I was on the bottom bunk, and I would leave early in the morning. They'd bus us to Central Church, and then we would have lectures until 12. At noon, we'd eat some rice and some malunggay stew, which is these malunggay leaves with some lentil-like things and carrots and just little onions. And then we would go out and do door-to-door work. Not really door-to-door because some of the places didn't have doors, but we would be going in the streets.
House to house.
House-to-house work,
There you go.
exactly. It was the end of the rainy season. And the end of the rainy season is very hot, very muggy, but the rain has pretty much stopped. And something happens at the end of rainy season that I had not realized. During rainy season, the frogs proliferate, and they are all over, like the plagues of Egypt, everywhere. They're hopping around like the real bumpy frogs. And so after the rains stop, then the canals outside along the streets, they start to dry up, and when they finally dry up, yeah,
I'm
what's
already
coming up.
envisioning this. Yes.
Yeah, that's the next plague of Egypt, the flies.
Oh,
So you've got
and the
pass,
smell.
and the smell, and the little bit of mud. So I would walk by these bloated, balloon-like bullfrogs covered with flies, and when you walk by them, the flies then kind of and they fly up in
That
your
sound
face
is so
and they,
accurate, Lisa. The sound is so accurate.
yeah, hit my legs and hit my arms. You're like, it's just awful. Then we would come back after that edifying experience of inviting people to the meetings and have our dinner and get bused to where the tent was. It was a big tent. And they were just benches, wooden benches. And we would sit there. And the thing about that time of season, it's still humid and it doesn't get cool at night. Like in California, at night, at least it gets cool in the evening. But there, it's hot in the day, and it's still pretty hot. So we're fanning ourselves with our programs, and those are the days of slides, not PowerPoints. Watching
Just the clicking.
and yes, the clicking and the translation. Everything had to be translated into Tagalog, and then we get back in the bus, and we get bussed back, and we would get back after curfew for the undergrads, but I don't remember how they arranged for us to get back in. So we did this day after day, 2 weeks. This whole thing went on. And it was towards the second week where one of all of my classmates were quite a bit older than me. Most were pastors already, and they were coming for their graduate degree. They'd gotten their first degree, they were pastor, and they came back for the master's degree. They were from Japan and China and India and Bangladesh and Philippines and Indonesia and all over that whole region. So I don't remember which country it was, but one of the senior men said, we're going to have a meeting in the bus. Don't go to the dorms, we're going to have a meeting. And so we got out of the bus. There was one guy who was a little bit older than me from India or Bangladesh. I don't remember which country. So he was the closest in age to me. And so we sat out on the grass, and I can still see the palm trees just kind of slightly moving in the breeze, and the moon behind there, and a little bit of clouds, but not very much wind. And we're sitting on the grass, and one man said, "This is ridiculous. I've been a pastor in my own country. I have conducted many evangelism series. We were supposed to write a complete evangelism series, and we didn't have laptops this day. At that time, you would have written it all out by hand. We didn't have typewriters there. So we had to do this whole series. So I've done evangelism in my country, and we had to do it in English, which for me was fine, but for some of these others from Korea and other places was not so fine. And so another one complained about the heat. They couldn't go back and see their wives and families during that 2-week period because we got up early all day there and then got back. And then on Sabbaths, it was not one meeting, it was two meetings, because we had the full day meeting at
Yep.
lunch, and then we have some afternoon visitations, and then another meeting. So it was even longer and harder. And it was physically, it was very demanding. Well, I had never written one sermon, never mind a whole evangelism series. So I was feeling stressed about it too. That was our final requirement. We had to hand in all of these sermon notes. And one of the guys then said, "This is ridiculous. I'm taking my family and we're flying back to whichever country it was." And another one said the same thing. And I was shocked because I really looked up to these men. They were older than me. They were like a bigger brother to me. I respected them. They were pastors. Some of them were ordained already. I'm a 20-something young, fairly recent baptism who more or less grew up Adventist, but public schools, and then my father in and out of the church. And I had this idea that these guys were right up there with God. And I started saying to myself, if these are men of God, there is no God. It was so deflating to me spiritually. And at the end of that whole thing, when they'd all bellyached enough, one of the pastors said, "Well, now, Sister Lisa, will you pray for us?" So I didn't say anything except that prayer. And I went to my room. I didn't say anything to my roommates that night, and just got up and trudged through the whole thing again. And then the next night I came back. I didn't say anything. What do I say to them? All I kept on saying to myself was, if these are men of God, there is no God. And that was the biggest crisis of faith that I had had up to the time of my baptism. Then we trudged through the whole thing, the meetings, the visitations, the bullfrogs, the flies, all of that. And that next evening, the Thai girl in the bed above me, we had mosquito nets, she had a book, and she reached it down under my mosquito net. She said, "Here, read this." And I had not said anything to them. They were younger than me, even younger than me. They were college students. Well, I was too, but
I know what you mean.
Yeah. And what it said, it was from the Ministry of Healing, and I'm paraphrasing now, but it said something to the effect that God sometimes allows sometimes God allows those in whom we place our trust to disappoint us, so we learn the folly of leaning on the arm of flesh rather than the everlasting arm. And I was like, wow. And I read it again, and she did not know any of the
Wow.
things that had happened. And I didn't snap out of it, but that's exactly what I needed to know, that they aren't God. And I had been leaning on the arm of flesh, not on God. And I'd allowed their human frailty to make me even question whether God existed at all. I was thinking during that time, this is ridiculous. What do I do? I'm going to get a BTH and I don't even believe in God. What do you do with a BTH when you don't believe in God?
Right.
Yeah.
Just because I want to make sure that we get as much of your life in here as possible here. What do you get a doctorate, a PhD?
Well,
Because I know as a 7-year-old, you were already planning on it. Do you
Yes.
end up getting yourself a PhD?
Yes, in an indirect way, because when I went to Finland, I was at Tampere, which is in the central part of Finland. Just before school started, the teacher of grade 5 and 6 had gotten up in a tree. Her son had shot an arrow in the tree, and I don't know why she didn't send her 12-year-old boy up and get the arrow out. But she went up, and when she tried to grab it, she flipped out of the tree backwards, and she broke her arm and leg. And they needed a teacher. So they asked me if I could teach, and me not knowing anything about education, and they said it's only for 2 months, at worst only till Christmas, so I agreed to do it. It was terrible. It was the worst thing I've ever done in my life.
Taking a drink of water at that moment.
I had no idea how to manage classrooms. I'd not been a teacher. It was desperate every day. I was just doing one day ahead to keep ahead of the students. It was a combined 5th and 6th grade class, so they're 12, 13 years old. And kids are poke holes in their eraser, and then when they think I'm not looking, they poke holes in each other, and they write notes, and they think I don't see. And
Teachers see everything. It's
right,
like parents.
exactly.
We all see everything.
Exactly. And then when spring came and the snow started to melt, the icicles started to melt, tip, 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 outside the window, and the sun is coming in. Can we go outside, teacher? And I wanted to go outside too, but I thought, no, I've got to keep them in here. And then one student asked me, teacher, why do earthworms have worms? Earthworms have rings. That's a really great question. I still don't know why earthworms have rings. But it was a challenging year, and I can remember walking home in tears. It was exhausting. I didn't know what I was doing. Really, I feel sorry for those students because I was winging it. But that was my introduction to education. I then I was pretty sure I didn't want to work with kids. So I went to Loma Linda, and I did a master's in public health. I was interested in education, and the door to ministry was closed. And they would accept me at Loma Linda, provided I took some prerequisites, biochemistry, microbiology, anatomy and physiology, and sociology.
So
I did
go on to
those.
get your master's in public health.
So I can teach. I thought, okay, I'll do that. And I went back to Finland, and I taught in our seminary for 3 years and did health evangelism. I thought, if I can't do church work, can't do evangelism, I can do this kind of evangelism.
Okay.
But I still had an eye on doing a doctorate. But I had in my mind still what my father said, okay, you do the bachelor's. Okay, got that done. Okay, now I've got the master's and then the PhD. And I applied to a number of places, and one of those was to the University of Hawaii, where my half of my family's from. I'd spent about 10 years in Finland on and off with my mother's side of the family. So I moved there and did the PhD and stayed on after that to work at the University of Hawaii. So yes, I got the PhD.
You're like, I did. Check. So what was your PhD in?
Educational psychology.
Okay.
My father wanted me still at this point to go into practice with him. He had a private practice by this point, but still he's working with psychiatric patients for the most part.
Not something you really were wanting to do.
I had grown up with that my whole life, and I saw that dark underbelly. Educational psychology deals with normal psychology, with learning, how to facilitate learning, and not when everything goes wrong emotionally. And to me, it really is fascinating to understand how do people learn, and much of the work I've done is how to measure that learning has taken place. And the Lord led that I would be working with the medical school there. I started evaluating how do physicians become competent, and how do you know that a physician is competent? How do you know that they have the clinical skills and the clinical reasoning? I was hired by the medical school to develop assessments of clinical competence, which laid the way for what I'm doing now.
Yeah. So you're in Hawaii, University of Hawaii area. I know that you have a really interesting story because I've heard you mention it a few times in Sabbath school, and I kind of want to be able to visit it. Where you're working, I believe, in Indiana. Might be wrong with Indiana. There's a state that you're working in, Illinois. Indiana. Okay, I knew it was right down near there. But you had a call to work at Andrews. Now, was this going to be your first call to work in Adventist schooling?
Well, I stayed at the University of Hawaii altogether. I was there about 5 years. After finishing my PhD, I was hired as an assistant professor in the School of Medicine. I had a joint appointment with psychiatry, which was with internal medicine, which was fine. I didn't want to get into psychiatry. I was on the same building with psychiatry. And I had a joint appointment with what was called the Liberal Studies program, which was the program at the university that allowed individuals to earn a degree in any field they wanted to, provided the university didn't already offer the degree at that level. So we had really bright and creative students design their own degrees, or it could be something that we offered at the graduate degree that wasn't offered at the undergraduate degree, or it could be a new thing like Hawaiian studies started in our program. And when enough people say they want to do Hawaiian studies or ESL, that becomes the trial area, and it shows that there's enough enrollment to sustain, and then it spins it off into a new program. So I worked in that program, which was really
That would have
helpful.
been fun.
It was. It was very fun because they had to defend a proposal of what this degree was, something creative or something more traditional that we didn't offer. And it helped me understand the nature of knowledge and disciplines in a university, which also helped me for this
Where you
degree.
are now.
Right.
Yes.
But I had a split appointment. I was half-time medicine in the Department of Internal Medicine and doing assessments of clinical competence, and half-time in liberal studies. And I wanted just one position because 2 half-times is...
It's a lot.
Right. It really is more like 2 full-times. And I was serving on some committees. I should tell you one story of one committee. That is master's dissertation committees. I was on a committee of a lady, and I was reading her thesis late at night in my office in art and liberal studies. And when I'd read it, I would then put it over here upside down to know that I read it and continue reading. And at one point late at night, I noticed that there was a little bit of melted chocolate on there. And I thought, that's odd. Have I been so engrossed in reading this thesis that I didn't notice I ate some chocolate? I'm not a snacker, but... So I opened my desk drawer and I look. No, I pull out the trash can, see if there's any wrapper in there. No, there isn't. I'm still baffled, so I reach over my finger and I look
Don't tell
at
me
it.
you're going to lick it.
Yeah, I
Come
was.
on,
And
Lisa.
then I just thought, that is so odd. So before I licked it, I just looked up from where the paper was, and there's a little gecko hanging
Oh,
upside down.
I'm so glad you did not lick that. So just
So-
so you know, Lisa, before you lick, you should at least sniff. Like sniff before you lick.
I did sniff.
Okay.
It didn't have a chocolate smell. That's why I, but it didn't have a bad smell either. So I had these 2 half-time jobs and then doing things like thesis supervision. And I was at the American Educational Research Association annual meeting. They have these job postings and interviews. So I started doing some interviews there, see what was out there. And one of the positions was this full-time position as assistant dean at the University of Illinois College of Medicine. And I applied, and the dean had come to Hawaii for some professional meetings, and he interviewed me here. And then they invited me to go there, and so that's how I shifted. I thought I'd be there just maybe 2-3 years, maybe 4 years, and maybe get to the rank of associate professor. And by then, something would open up back at the University of Hawaii. There would be one full-time position. But I ended up staying there for 8 years. And that was the story that you had heard about.
Yeah. So from the University of Illinois, you were there for 8 years, and then you were at Andrews for how many years?
Well, by year 6, I think it was, I started to feel really restless. And I thought it might be depression. So I went to my primary care physician, and I said, I think I'm depressed. So she did a complete history and physical, and she said, I can prescribe you some antidepressants, and they work. But she said, before I do that, I'd like you to really think if there's anything going on in your life that this might be a symptom of. And I said, well, okay. Because she said, once I prescribe antidepressants, it's going to be part of your medical record forever. I work in a medical school. And I think, do I really want antidepressants part of my medical record forever if I don't even know what's causing the depression? So I agreed with her. Okay, let me figure this out. So I thought it could be seasonal affective disorder because my office was in the tornado shelter of the medical school. Underground.
Yeah.
So when I drive in the morning, it was dark. In the wintertime, I'd be underground. And if a tornado come, I'd be really safe, but it was dark.
But the rest of the time, it's just dark.
It's dark. It's dark. Yep. Fluorescent lights. Yeah. And then for lunch, I'd run over to Methodist Medical Center for lunch, get a sandwich, and then I'd come back. But that's 7-minute walk one way and a 7-minute walk back. And I'd go back down to the tornado shelter. So I thought it could be light. And I knew that from living in Finland before, that those long, dark winters really just would make me feel depressed. So I went to Florida for a week's vacation. I thought this will do it. And it was beautiful, Sanibel Island for one day, and picked shells, and it was just glorious. And the next day, get up, and it's raining. And the next
Oh,
day,
no.
and the next day, and the rest of the week, it rained every single day. So I went back, and I was still feeling just depressed. Then my secretary brought me the schedule for the academic calendar for all the exams. I oversaw all the exams of the medical students. And there on one sheet of paper, when I looked at that, that feeling of depression, it's like, poof. And I realized that I knew exactly what I'd be doing for every day for the next year on that one piece of paper. I knew the exams, what would take to prepare the exams, to score the exams.
You
meeting
needed
with
a
students.
change.
Exactly. I knew that what I really needed was a change. So I did chaplaincy training at the Methodist Medical Center of Illinois. I negotiated with the dean to use 1 day of vacation per week to do CPE, clinical pastoral education, every Monday. And then all the other chaplains in training were Sunday chaplains. They wanted Sunday off, so I agreed that I would come in at 2 o'clock on a Saturday after I was done with church, and I would start taking call at 2 p.m., and I would then do all Sunday night, because they didn't want to be on call Sunday night when they're going to be at a Sunday church, and I would stay until the following day at noon, and I would oversee the Sunday service at the church, at the medical center's chapel, if there was a patient who wanted something. So I did that for 9 months, and then in the following year, I applied for sabbatical, and that was approved, and I was going to do another unit of CPE, which is an intensive, because I realized part of what was really depressing me is I felt like I was selling myself out for money. I was paid really well at the University of Illinois. It's a good job. It's a prestigious institution. Technically, it was getting boring, but more importantly, I didn't feel like spiritually it was
being
meaningful.
fulfilled.
Exactly. So I thought the chaplaincy would do that. And so I applied for that and was approved. There are 4 sites of the University of Illinois College of Medicine in Peoria, where I was, Chicago, Champaign-Urbana, and Rockford.
So, because our time is quickly coming to an end here, I want to make sure we get through it. Because I know that you end up at Andrews. How many years did you serve at Andrews?
Altogether, it was less than 2 years.
Less than 2 years. Where did you go from Andrews?
Loma Linda started, in my first year, Loma Linda started trying to persuade me to come there. And I said no. And then another member of the search committee called, and I said no. And then a third person called me, and I said, Lord, is that you? Thinking of little Samuel. And so I agreed to an interview with the president. And I told them, if you can't wait for a year, because now it was like September or October, I didn't want to leave the university.
And you want to finish the year.
So I said, if you can't wait, if you got another candidate, that's fine, just go ahead. And they said, no, we'll wait. And then I told Andrews, I'll stay until this point, and if you can find someone sooner, I'll leave earlier. So I ended up leaving about 2 months earlier.
Okay. So then how many years were
8
you
years. Another 8
Loma
years.
Linda? 8 years.
Yes.
And then where do you go from Loma Linda?
Here.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was a quick trend.
Yeah.
So were you called as an associate director
Yes.
here?
I was called to be associate director, and that too, I didn't know how the church worked. I really did not grow up in church circles. I don't have any influential relatives. The other side,
Neither do I.
the other side are still all Buddhist, and the others are the Reformed side. They've pretty much died out. Now, those that are still Adventists are regular Adventists. There are no more Reformed. Both my grandparents died Reformed, but they're not in any positions. I didn't have any advocates. I didn't know how you get jobs in Adventism. Even at Andrews, I didn't know how you get a job because they don't hire or they don't advertise through the Chronicle of Higher Ed, which is how you normally get academic jobs, and they're not at the professional meetings doing interviews. So I had no idea. It was just one big puzzle box. How do you actually get a job?
Get a job within Adventism.
You're right, exactly.
And now here you are, and you become the associate.
Well, the director, Dr. Doolan, said, "Would you let your name stand for nomination?" Well, that sounds pretty innocuous.
You're
Okay.
like, sure.
Yeah, okay, right. I really didn't know what that means because I had, for all my other academic jobs, I'd gone through the normal search process of you submit your CV, you have interviews.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the GC election cycle it's a whole nother beast that
right.
is very different than the regular hiring circles. So, how long?
So it was just like a week later, he calls, he said, "So you are nominated." And it's like, okay. I mean,
Okay, what's that mean?
yeah. So that was a very, very, and that whole thing happened so quickly. I said, I can't just immediately come. I'll do the best I can. And the person that was here, that was Andrea Luxton, also needed to bring some things to a close. She was going to be president of Canadian University College, Burman University now. So she needed a period of transition, and I needed to get moved, even pack,
Yeah.
to come out here. So I ended up coming in October, about 6 months later.
So, how long have you served here in the education department?
Well, that was 2006
Okay,
as
I'm
associate.
trying really hard to do math.
Yeah, 2006. And in 2010, I was at GC session, and during, I think it was Dwight Nelson who was preaching, doing a devotional. During that devotional, I saw one of the presidents of one of the universities, and I needed to talk to him. So I stepped out of the hall there to talk with him about a search that he had undergoing. Most of the searches aren't calls. They do normal academic things. But I talked with him about it, and while I was back there standing, I came back, and Karnik Dukmetsian grabs me by the hand, and he said, "I need to talk to you." And I was like, okay. He was with risk management then. Okay. So I came out, and he said, has Bob Kite talked to you? Bob Kite was with Office of Legal Counsel. I thought, man, no. But
You're like in trouble.
No, I'm really in trouble because I've got risk manager in the Office of General Counsel trying to talk to me. And Bob Kite comes up and he said, "Has Ted talked to you?" No.
You're really in trouble now, Lisa.
I was objecting to something that was being proposed to policy. And we don't have time to go into that. And I had talked to Karnik about that, and I said, these are the reasons why I object to this policy change. So I thought it was about that conversation of policy change. In fact, it was voted down, but it was nearly not voted down, and I had very strong feelings. So I thought this was all about the policy change.
But it was actually to call you to be the
So
director?
So now they pull me to the back of the stage and said, now the delegates want to see who's nominated. And so I'm standing there, and then at that point, Ted comes up and kind of just says hello, and then someone pushes me out onto the stage, and I'm just standing there, and the lights blinking, and then somebody's out on the other side, "Come over here, come over." So, okay. I walk over there, and then I'm standing in the back. There are monitors back there. Then I see all the yellow cards going up. This whole thing happened so quickly without me clearly understanding what's going on. By the time the vote was taken and I realized what it was, I came down the stairs to go to my seat. My phone, at that time they gave us special GC phones we were supposed to carry with us all the time. I didn't, because I'd found that president who I just stepped aside to talk to some 35 minutes earlier. There were all these calls where they were trying to call me, but it was there in my purse on the seat.
Oh, no.
And John Fowler comes walking up to me, and he's smiling from ear to ear, and he says, "Nobody could be more pleased than me." He was an associate in the department too. He said, "Nobody could be more pleased than me." He said, "You are the man for the job." So that's how I got elected.
You became the director.
I became the director.
That was that's quite that's quite the story, Lisa. The whole situation is interesting when you watch how elections and all of that happen. But that might be one of the most unique stories I've heard about an election at a GC session.
I did not have any inkling that would happen. I truly did not. In fact, I already had applications out, and I already had an offer for a job interview.
But here you are today, still helping lead the higher education, because that's what we do here at the GC, the higher education of Seventh-day Adventism. And you've done a phenomenal job with it.
It's been a privilege. One of the things I'm really pleased about are the medical schools that we've been able to start. And that's why I think the Lord led me through all those experiences.
Was so that you would be here at this time, because
Right.
you're the man for the job.
I'm
as
the
John
man for the
Fowler
job.
said.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us, Lisa. I really, really appreciate this time. And I feel like I know so much more about you. And it's really interesting to see how God has led you to where you are, and gave you so many unique experiences and gifts in order to be able to better fulfill serving his church at this time in our history. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. It's been a privilege.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of A&N Profiles with my special guest, Lisa Beardsley-Hardy. If you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to our podcast or YouTube channel, wherever it is you are tuning in from today. I don't want you to miss any future episodes. Thank you for spending this time with us, and join us next time as I continue to get to know the life stories of more inspiring people.